Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into an age of soot, sideburns and suffocating politeness. Everyday life in Victorian England. Forget the cosy version Hollywood sold you, the candlelit parlours, the dashing gentleman, the tasteful romance conducted entirely through meaningful glances. The real thing was greamier, smellier, and far more likely to give you cholera before lunch. This was an era that produced the steam engine, the postage stamp, and the unshakable national belief that showing an ankle was a moral emergency. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Honestly, this channel runs on your ideas, and the comment section is doing more curating than I am at this point. If you'd rather drift off with your eyes shut, we're now on Spotify too, with the link waiting patiently in the description. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and tuck your feet in away from the imaginary draft. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what life actually felt like back then? Did people really bathe just once a year? Or is that slander? Could you survive a job that started before sunrise, ended after dark, and offered roughly 0 weekends and 1 half-day off, if your employer was feeling generous? What did anyone do about a toothache before painkillers existed? Would you last a single morning laced into a corset, breathing at 30% capacity, while being told you looked delicate? And could you sip a glass of perfectly ordinary London water without accidentally signing your own death warrant? Well, you're about to find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1851. The empire is vast, the queen is grumpy, and your chamber pot is full. Good luck. Let's start where every miserable day starts. Waking up. You blink awake in a narrow terraced house wedged so tightly against its neighbours that you can hear the family next door arguing about turnips through the wall. There's no central heating, no insulation, and the window has a draught you could sail a small boat through. You share a bed with at least 2 siblings, one of whom kicks like a startled mule. The air is thick with coal smoke that crept in overnight, settling on everything including your lungs. Somewhere downstairs someone is already raking out yesterday's ashes. Welcome to Mourning in Victorian England, where the day begins cold, dark, and faintly flavoured with soot. The first sensation is cold, the deep bone-settling kind that no blanket can quite defeat. Your bedroom, if you can call a shared upstairs box a bedroom, has a temperature roughly matching the street outside. The fire downstairs went out hours ago, and relighting it is somebody's job, probably yours, and definitely not a pleasant one. You can see your own breath drifting upward in pale little clouds, which is charming for about half a second before you remember you have to get up and put your bare feet on a floor cold enough to store butter. Then there's the smell, a layered and committed sort of smell. Coal smoke is the base note, ever present, the perfume of the entire century. On top of that, you've got the lingering aroma of last night's supper, the chamber pot in the corner doing its quiet work, and the damp that lives in the walls like a permanent lodger. If you've got animals, or a neighbour with animals, or a tannery down the road, the bouquet gets richer still. Imagine waking up inside a fireplace that's also a wet sock. That's roughly the experience. Light, what little there is, comes filtering through a grimy window that hasn't been properly cleaned since the previous decade. Glass was taxed for a good chunk of the era, so windows tend to be small and few, which means your home spends most of the day in a kind of permanent dusk. You don't so much wake up to sunshine as to a vague greyish suggestion that morning has technically arrived. It's like living inside a sepia photograph, only colder and with more coughing. Your bed itself is a modest affair, a straw or flock mattress that has compressed over the years into something with the give of a packed sandbag. The sheets, if you have them, are washed rarely because washing is an exhausting all-day ordeal. So you, your siblings, and a healthy population of fleas and bedbugs all share this cosy arrangement, locked in nightly combat. You wake up with fresh bites and the grim acceptance that this is simply what skin is for now. Getting out of bed requires strategy. Move too fast and the cold hits like a slap. Move too slow and you'll be late, and lateness has consequences when your livelihood depends on a punctual arrival at a factory that fines you for tardiness. So you steel yourself, fling back the blanket, and commit to the unpleasantness, dressing in a hurried, shivering scramble while your breath fogs the air. And all of this, the cold, the smell, the dark, the bites, is just the opening act. You haven't eaten, haven't washed, haven't faced the chamber pot, and haven't stepped into the soup of the street. You've merely survived the night, which, to be fair, was never entirely guaranteed. Mourning in Victorian England isn't a fresh start. It's a damp, smoky reminder that the day intends to be difficult, and it's only just getting warmed up. It's time to address the unpleasant business of where, exactly, you relieve yourself. Spoiler, it is not a bathroom. For most of you, it's a chamber pot kept under the bed, lovingly filled overnight and waiting to be carried downstairs and emptied, ideally without sloshing. If you're slightly fancier, you've got an outdoor privy at the bottom of the garden, shared with several other households and a thriving community of flies. The truly wealthy might own a brand new water closet, which floods the whole house with sewer gas because the plumbing hasn't quite figured out the trap yet. Either way, your morning routine involves more bravery than dignity. Let's begin with the humble chamber pot, the unsung centerpiece of domestic life. It lives under the bed, within easy reach for those midnight emergencies, which means you're sleeping mere inches above the previous night's contributions. In the morning, someone has to carry it downstairs and out to be emptied, and that someone treats every staircase like a tightrope walk, because a spill is a catastrophe nobody wants to be responsible for. It's a delicate art. The dignified transport of a full chamber pot, and one rarely celebrated in the history books. If you're lucky enough to have an outdoor privy, congratulations. You've upgraded to a small wooden shed positioned a brisk, often rainy walk from the house. It's essentially a bench with a hole over a pit or a cesspool, and it's almost never just yours. Several families share it, which means timing is everything, and queuing is a genuine morning ritual. In summer, the smell announces itself from across the garden, and in winter you risk frostbite in places frostbite has no business reaching. There is no privacy worth mentioning, no comfort whatsoever, and the resident spiders consider it their kingdom. Then there's the matter of what you use to clean up afterward, and here I'll simply say that soft, gentle toilet paper is a luxury of the distant future. You're working with newspaper, scraps of rag, or whatever's to hand, and the wealthy might splurge on something marginally kinder. The phrase reading material in the privy comes from a literal place, since yesterday's newspaper served two purposes, only one of which involved reading. Now the cesspools beneath all this need emptying, and that grim task falls to men called night soil men, who arrive after dark to shovel out the accumulated waste and cart it away. It's a job that pays surprisingly well, presumably because the labour pool is understandably reluctant. They work by lantern light, hauling buckets of unspeakable cargo through sleeping streets, and the city quietly depends on them while pretending they don't exist. For the affluent, the water closet arrives as the dazzling future of sanitation, a flushing marvel that whisks waste away with a satisfying rush of water. The trouble is that early plumbing lacks a proper trap, so the same pipes that carry waste out also carry sewer gas back in, filling fashionable homes with a smell that quietly defeats the whole point. People genuinely believe this foul air caused disease, and in a roundabout way, the houses with the newest technology were sometimes the smelliest of all. So whether you're squatting over a shared pit, balancing a chamber pot down a dark staircase, or marvelling at a water closet that gasses your guests, the Victorian relationship with bodily functions is one of constant low-grade indignity. It is cold, communal, malodorous, and entirely without privacy. You handle it quickly, you breathe through your mouth, and you get on with your day. After all, the chamber pot will be waiting again tonight, faithful as ever. Now for breakfast, assuming you can stomach it. If you're poor, it's bread, dripping, and weak tea brewed from leaves that have already been used twice, and possibly bulked out with dried hawthorn. If you're middle class, congratulations, you get eggs, bacon, kippers, and a frankly aggressive quantity of toast. But here's the catch. Nearly everything you eat has been quietly tampered with by someone trying to make a profit. Your bread may contain alum, your tea might be dyed with lead, and your milk has been watered down and topped off with a splash of chalk. Bon appétit. For the working poor, breakfast is a study in making very little go a long way. The centrepiece is bread, that eternal staple, smeared with dripping, which is the fat saved from previously cooked meat, congealed and reused until it's a distant memory of flavour. Wash it down with tea so weak and so often re-steeped that it's less a beverage and more a warm suggestion of one. If the household is doing well that week, there might be a scrape of jam or a knob of cheese. If not, there's bread, and there's more bread, and there's the quiet hope that it'll keep you upright until the next meal. Climb the social ladder a rung or two, and breakfast becomes a heartier, more theatrical affair. The Victorian middle class adored a substantial morning spread. Eggs cooked several ways, rashers of bacon, kippers staring up at you with their accusatory little eyes, sausages, kidneys, and toast stacked with the confidence of a household that knows where its next meal is coming from. It's the ancestor of the full English, and it's designed to fuel a day of looking busy and important. But here's where things get sinister, because regardless of your class, the food itself is engaged in a quiet campaign against you. Food adulteration is the great open secret of the age. Manufacturers and shopkeepers, unburdened by anything resembling regulation, bulk out their products with whatever's cheap and available. Your bread gets a dose of alum to make it whiter and weigh more. Your flour might be cut with chalk or even ground bones. It's less a loaf and more a chemistry experiment with a crust. Tea, that sacred British comfort, is a particular victim. Used leaves are dried, dyed, and resold, sometimes coloured with substances containing lead or copper to restore their convincing greenish-black hue. You might be sipping a brew that's been around the block several times and finished with a garnish of heavy metals. The milk you add to it has likely been watered down to stretch the supply, then thickened back up with a little chalk and, in the worst cases, a splash of something to mask the fact that it started to turn. Even the sweet things conspire against you. Sugar is bulked with sand, candy is brightened with genuinely toxic dyes, and pickles are sometimes greened with copper to look more appetizing. The whole grocery shelf is a minefield, and the consumer has almost no way of knowing which products are honest and which are slowly poisoning the family. It takes decades of campaigning before laws finally drag the food trade towards something like safety. So you sit down to your morning meal, whatever it happens to be, in a kind of cheerful ignorance. The bread looks like bread, the tea looks like tea, and your stomach has learned, through grim repetition, to simply cope. You eat, you drink, you feel vaguely unwell, and you assume that's just how breakfast feels. In Victorian England, the most dangerous part of your day might well be the meal that started it. Let's talk about getting dressed, which in Victorian England is less an activity and more a construction project. If you're a woman, you begin with a chemise, then drawers, then a corset laced tight enough to rearrange your internal organs, then a crinoline cage the width of a doorway, then petticoats, then the actual dress on top. By the time you're finished, you're wearing roughly 15 pounds of fabric and can no longer bend at the waist. Men get off easier, though they're still buttoned, collared and waistcoated into a state of permanent stiffness. Comfort was simply not on the menu. Begin with the foundation, the chemise, a simple linen or cotton garment worn against the skin to protect the expensive outer layers from sweat. Over that go the drawers, then the corset, and then the real engineering begins. A woman of any standing does not simply dress herself. She's assembled, often with the help of a maid or a long-suffering relative tugging at laces. It's a process measured not in moments but in patient, breathless minutes. Then comes the crinoline, the great architectural marvel of the mid-century. This is a cage of steel hoops worn beneath the skirt to give it that enormous bell-shaped silhouette so beloved by fashion plates. It's lighter than the alternative, which was layering on half a dozen heavy petticoats, but it comes with its own perils. A crinoline catches the wind like a sail, knocks over furniture and small children, makes sitting down a tactical manoeuvre, and, most alarmingly, has an unfortunate habit of catching fire near open hearths. Many women lost their lives this way, which is a sobering footnote to a frankly absurd fashion. After the crinoline comes the layering of petticoats, then the dress itself with its tight bodice, its fitted sleeves, and its yards upon yards of fabric. Add a collar, cuffs, perhaps a shawl, and the inevitable hat, gloves and boots, and you are now wearing an outfit that weighs as much as a small child and offers all the freedom of movement of a suit of armour. Walking requires planning. Doorways require strategy. A simple turn to greet someone becomes a slow, deliberate rotation, like a ship coming about. Men, it's true, have a gentler time of it, but gentle is relative. A respectable gentleman wears a shirt with a stiff detachable collar, starched hard enough to leave marks, a waistcoat, a frock coat or morning coat, trousers, and a cravat or necktie knotted at the throat. The collar in particular is a small instrument of torture, rigid and unforgiving, soaring gently at the neck throughout the day. Add a top hat and a pair of polished boots, and the Victorian man is properly attired, properly uncomfortable and properly unable to slouch. Children fare no better, dressed as miniature adults from a young age, the boys in little suits and the girls in their own small corsets and layered skirts, prepared early for a lifetime of being beautifully constrained. The notion of comfortable, practical clothing for play simply doesn't fit the era's idea of how a respectable young person should appear, and so the whole of Victorian society goes about its day fully assembled, laced, buttoned, hooped and starched into rigidity. Getting dressed isn't a quick affair you knock out before coffee. It's a daily ritual of effort and discomfort, a small monument to the era's belief that looking proper was infinitely more important than feeling well. By the time you're finally clothed, you've earned a rest you absolutely will not be getting. Speaking of corsets, they deserve their own moment of horror. From girlhood onward, you're laced into one daily, the boning pressing your ribs inward and your posture into something the era politely called elegant. Doctors warned it could displace organs, restrict breathing, and cause fainting, which it absolutely did, though fainting was also considered rather feminine and charming, so nobody minded too much. You learn to breathe shallowly, sit upright, and never, ever take a deep, satisfying breath again. It's like wearing a very stylish full-body splint that society insists is a sign of good character. The corset isn't merely an undergarment, it's a statement of moral and social worth. A small, tightly laced waist signals discipline, refinement and respectability, while letting your figure go was seen as a sign of slovenliness or worse. So from a young age, girls are introduced to the daily ritual of lacing, their developing bodies gradually shaped by the relentless pressure of whalebone, steel and tightly drawn cord. It's a fashion that quite literally moulds you to its will. The construction is genuinely formidable. Strips of baleen taken from whales or thin steel busks provide the rigid structure, and the whole thing is cinched at the back, often by someone else, since reaching your own laces is a contortionist's challenge. The tighter the lacing, the smaller the waist, and the more fashionable the silhouette. Some women pursued the coveted handspan waist, an obsessive smallness that came at a considerable cost to the everyday business of being alive. And the cost was real. With the ribs compressed and the torso squeezed, breathing becomes a shallow, careful affair. Take the stairs too quickly, lace too tightly, or stand too long in a warm, crowded room, and the result is the famous Victorian faint, a genuine loss of consciousness from restricted breathing and poor circulation. Helpfully, society reframed this medical event as charmingly delicate and feminine, so a woman collapsing was less an alarm and more a quiet compliment to her refinement. The fainting couch was furniture designed for exactly this. Doctors of the era weren't blind to the dangers, and many warned loudly about the consequences. Prolonged tight lacing could weaken the back muscles, restrict the lungs, and over time press the internal organs into unnatural positions. The liver, the stomach, and the intestines all got rearranged by years of constant compression. Whether every dire warning was accurate or somewhat exaggerated, the basic discomfort was undeniable, and yet the fashion held firm, because looking correct outranks nearly everything else. There were always rebels and reformers, of course. The dress reform movement campaigned for looser, healthier clothing, arguing that women might accomplish rather more if they could breathe and bend. But change came slowly, and for the average woman, the corset remained a daily fixture, as unquestioned as putting on shoes. You simply adapted, learning to move, sit and breathe within its rigid embrace. The strangest part is how normal it all became. A woman laced into a corset every morning of her life eventually forgets what a full, deep breath even feels like. The shallow, careful breathing becomes simply how breathing is done. The upright posture becomes natural because slouching is physically impossible. The garment shapes not just the body but the entire way one moves through the world. So spare a thought for the Victorian woman, beautifully shaped and quietly suffocating, going about her day in a garment that turned her own ribcage against her. She endured it with grace, because grace was the whole point, and she made it look effortless, which was perhaps the greatest illusion of all. Beneath every elegant silhouette was a person simply trying to take the next small breath. Now let's discuss hygiene, a topic Victorians approached with deep suspicion. A full body bath is a major undertaking, requiring water to be hauled, heated over a fire, and poured into a tin tub in front of the hearth, where the whole family will use the same water in order of seniority. By the time the youngest child climbs in, it's lukewarm and the colour of weak gravy. Most people make do with a daily wash from a basin, focusing on the face, hands, and the parts of the neck that show. The rest of you is simply left to its own devices. The fundamental obstacle to cleanliness is, quite simply, water and the heroic effort required to get it where you want it. There's no tap delivering hot water on demand. Every drop must be carried, often from a shared pump or well down the street, hauled home in heavy buckets, and then heated over the fire in pots and kettles. To fill a single bathtub takes dozens of trips, and a roaring fire burning expensive coal. A proper bath, then, isn't a casual indulgence. It's a labour-intensive project that occupies the better part of a morning. This is why the family bath, when it happens, is a shared and rigidly hierarchical event. One tub is filled, and the household takes turns in strict order of importance. Usually the father first, then the mother, then down through the children by age. By the time the smallest child is lowered in, the water has gone tepid and murky, having absorbed the grime of everyone who came before. The unfortunate last bather essentially soaks in a thin family soup, which somewhat undermines the entire point of the exercise. For day-to-day cleanliness, most people rely on the basin and jug, a far more manageable affair. You pour a little water into a basin, wet a cloth, and give yourself what was politely termed a wash, attending mainly to the face, the hands, and the visible portion of the neck. The areas hidden by clothing get a more theoretical sort of attention. It's a strategy built around appearing clean to others rather than achieving any deep, thorough cleanliness, which, given the effort involved, is an entirely understandable compromise. There's also a lingering medical suspicion of water itself, particularly of immersing the whole body too often. Some held that frequent bathing weakened the constitution or left the pores dangerously open to disease, echoing older fears from previous centuries. Combine that anxiety with a sheer inconvenience, and the result is a culture that prizes the appearance of cleanliness, fresh linen, a clean collar, a washed face, over the reality of a thoroughly scrubbed body. Soap exists, but good soap is taxed for much of the era, keeping the gentler varieties as a middle-class comfort. The poor make do with harsh, cheap soap that's rough on the skin, or with no soap at all. Hair is washed rarely, and instead brushed obsessively, the idea being that vigorous brushing distributes the natural oils and keeps things presentable between the infrequent proper washes. A respectable head of hair might go weeks without ever meeting water. As the era progresses and the link between filth and disease becomes harder to ignore, attitudes slowly begin to shift. The wealthy install proper bathrooms, public baths open for the working classes, and cleanliness inches toward the cherished virtue we'd recognise today. But for most of the period, the everyday reality is a quick basin wash, a fresh collar over an unwashed body, and a full bath reserved for special occasions. So you go about your day clean where it counts, and conveniently grubby everywhere else, smelling, like everyone around you, of coal smoke, sweat, and the faint perfume of a body that hasn't been fully submerged in quite some time. In a world where everyone shares the same fragrant predicament, nobody's nose is doing much complaining anyway. Let's flash a smile, or at least attempt one. Sugar has flooded into Britain by the bucket load, and your teeth are paying the price. Toothbrushes exist but are a luxury, and toothpaste is often an abrasive powder made from chalk, charcoal, or crushed brick that scrubs your enamel into oblivion. When a tooth goes bad, your options are grim. A dentist who'll yank it out with a key-shaped tool and no anaesthetic, or a folk remedy involving cloves and prayer. The wealthy might invest in false teeth, sometimes carved from ivory, sometimes pulled from the mouths of dead soldiers. Yes, really. The root of the problem, fittingly, is sugar. As the British Empire expanded its trade, sugar poured into the country in unprecedented quantities and dropped in price, transforming from a rare luxury into an everyday indulgence. People sweetened their tea, gorged on cakes and confections, and sucked on boiled sweets with enthusiasm. Their teeth, having evolved over millennia for a far less sugary existence, simply could not cope. Decay became a national epidemic, and a mouthful of rotten teeth became almost unremarkable. Dental hygiene, where it existed at all, was a rudimentary business. A toothbrush was a real possession but not a universal one, and the tooth powders sold to scrub your teeth were frequently more menacing than the decay they fought. Many were gritty concoctions of chalk, charcoal, ground brick, or cuttlefish bone, abrasive enough to polish your teeth right through the enamel and into the soft, vulnerable layers beneath. You scrubbed away believing you were doing good, slowly sanding down the very protection your teeth needed most. When a tooth finally gave out, and it almost always did, the experience that followed was the stuff of nightmares. Anesthetics were limited or non-existent for much of the era, so the extraction of a tooth was a brutally direct affair. The dentist or the barber or the local strongman with a reputation for the work would grip the offending tooth with an iron instrument called a dental key and simply wrench it free, often breaking the tooth or damaging the jaw in the process. The patient endured this fully conscious, fortified by nothing more than perhaps a stiff drink and a tight grip on the chair. Before resorting to extraction, people tried every folk remedy imaginable. Oil of cloves was rubbed on aching gums for its numbing properties, one of the few genuinely useful treatments. Beyond that, the suggestions grew creative and desperate. Poultices, tinctures, mysterious patent medicines promising miraculous relief and a healthy dose of prayer. A toothache was a constant, gnawing companion that could rob you of sleep, food, and sanity, and the available comforts were thin indeed. For those with money, the solution to a mouthful of missing teeth was a set of false ones, and here the story takes a genuinely macabre turn. Dentures were carved from ivory or bone, but the most prized teeth were real human ones, and the supply came from grim sources. Teeth were pulled from corpses, harvested from graves, and most notoriously gathered in enormous quantities from the bodies of soldiers killed in battle, so-called Waterloo teeth, taken from the fallen of that famous conflict, were sold and set into dentures for the living, who chewed their dinners with the teeth of dead young men. As the century wore on, dentistry slowly professionalised. Anaesthesia eventually arrived to spare patients the worst of the agony, and the link between sugar and decay became better understood. But for the average Victorian, a smile was a gamble, a toothache was a near certainty, and the dentist's chair was a place approached with genuine dread. You learned, quite sensibly, to smile with your lips closed. Time for work, and there's no avoiding it. If you're one of the millions powering the Industrial Revolution, you head off to a factory where the day begins before dawn and ends well after dark, 6 days a week. The machines are loud, fast, and entirely uninterested in your fingers. The air is thick with cotton dust or metal filings. The noise is deafening, and a foreman patrols the floor ready to dock your pay for so much as a yawn. There are no safety guards, no breaks worth mentioning, and certainly no complaining. You're a small, replaceable cog, and the factory has plenty of spares. The day begins in the dark, summoned by the factory bell or the knocker-up, a person paid to go round the streets tapping on bedroom windows with a long pole to wake the workers, since alarm clocks are a luxury few can afford. You stumble out into the cold morning, joining a tide of others trudging toward the same gates, and you better be on time, because the doors close at the appointed hour, and latecomers are locked out, fined, or sent home without pay. Punctuality isn't a virtue here, it's a financial necessity. Inside, the factory is an assault on every sense at once. The noise comes first, the relentless clatter and roar of machinery so loud that workers learn to read lips and communicate in gestures, many going partially deaf over the years. Then the air, thick with floating cotton fibres in the textile mills, or metal dust in the foundries, settling in your lungs with every breath, and laying the groundwork for the chronic coughs and lung diseases that haunt industrial workers. The heat, the damp, the smell of oil and bodies, it all combines into an atmosphere you don't so much work in as endure. The work itself is repetitive, exhausting, and relentlessly fast, set to the unforgiving pace of the machines rather than the limits of the human body. You stand for 12 hours or more, performing the same motion thousands of times, your attention fixed because a single lapse can be catastrophic. The machinery has no guards, no safety features, No concern for the soft and breakable people tending it. Loose clothing, long hair, or a tired hand can be caught in an instant, and the toll of lost fingers, crushed limbs, and worse is simply accepted as the cost of doing business. Overseeing it all is the foreman, a figure of considerable dread, prowling the floor with an eye for any sign of slacking. Pause to stretch, to chat, to rest your aching back, and you risk a fine deducted straight from your meagre wages, or a sharp word, or worse. The system of fines is its own quiet cruelty, with deductions for lateness, for talking, for imperfections in the work, for a window left open or a light left burning. By the end of the week, a worker might find a startling chunk of their pay has simply evaporated into the employer's pocket. Breaks are minimal and grudging. You might get a brief pause to eat whatever cold scrap you've brought, often consumed standing beside the machine that never stops needing you. There's no weekend in the modern sense, only the long stretch of 6 working days before the single day of rest, which is largely consumed by the chores and errands that couldn't be done during the working week. For all this, the wages are barely enough to keep a family fed and housed, and the constant fear of dismissal hangs over everyone, because for every worker there are others desperate to take the place. You are, in the cold arithmetic of the factory, entirely replaceable, and the machinery will keep turning whether you're there to feed it or not. So you labour on, deaf, exhausted and coated in dust, a single small part of the vast engine remaking the world. The Industrial Revolution built astonishing wealth and wonder, but it ran on the bodies of people like you, and it asked for everything you had, 12 grinding hours at a time. If you think the factories were hard on adults, let's talk about the children, because Victorian England absolutely put them to work. Boys as young as 5 scramble up chimneys to sweep them, small enough to fit and cheap enough to be expendable. Others crawl beneath thundering machines to retrieve loose threads, or spend 12-hour days in coal mines hauling carts through tunnels too low for a grown adult. School is a luxury most can't afford, and childhood as you know it is a concept reserved for the rich. By the time reform finally arrives, an entire generation has already grown up old before their time. Consider first the climbing boys, the small children sent up chimneys to clean them from the inside. The work demanded a body tiny enough to fit into a flue sometimes no wider than a forearm, so master sweeps took on children as young as 4 or 5, often orphans or the children of the desperately poor. These little ones were sent scrambling up into the soot and darkness, scraping the chimney clean with their bare hands and knees, breathing in clouds of choking ash. They suffered scraped and bleeding skin, deformed limbs, and a particular cancer so associated with the trade it was simply called chimney sweep's cancer. Some became stuck and suffocated in the dark. In the textile mills, children were prized for their small, nimble fingers and their small bodies, which could dart into spaces too cramped for adults. The scavengers, often very young, crawled beneath the running machinery to gather up the loose cotton and tie broken threads, working amid the very gears and belts that could maim them in a heartbeat. They worked the same brutal 12-hour days as the adults, fighting to stay awake, knowing that exhaustion near the machines could cost them a hand or their life. The coal mines were grimmer still. Children worked deep underground, some as trappers, sitting alone in the pitch black for hours to open and close the ventilation doors as the coal carts passed. Others, barely older, hauled those heavy carts through tunnels too low for grown men to stand in, harnessed like little animals and crawling through the dark on hands and knees. The mines were cold, wet, dangerous, and utterly without mercy, and the children who worked them rarely saw daylight during the long winter months. What's most striking is how normal all of this was considered. A poor family often had no choice but to send its children out to earn. because a child's wages, however small, might mean the difference between eating and starving. Childhood as a protected, carefree time was a notion the poor simply could not afford. From the moment they were physically capable, children were expected to contribute, and their small earnings were woven into the family's fragile survival. Education, meanwhile, remained out of reach for most. Schooling cost money and, more importantly, cost the wages a working child could bring home. So few poor children learned more than the most basic letters, if they learned anything at all. The bright, curious mind of a child was a luxury the economy had no use for, and so it went unschooled and unfed, set to labour instead. Change, when it came slowly and against fierce resistance. Reformers, writers, and a handful of conscientious politicians campaigned against the worst abuses, and a series of Factory Acts and Mines Acts gradually raised the minimum working age, limited hours, and eventually pulled children out of the chimneys and the mines and toward the schoolroom. But reform arrived piecemeal and late, and for vast numbers of children it came too late entirely. So as you go about your Victorian day, spare a thought for the smallest workers, the climbing boys black with soot, the scavengers darting under the looms, the trappers alone in the dark. They powered the same great machine the adults did, and they paid for it with their childhoods, their health, and far too often, their lives. Let's step outside, though you may regret it. London is famous for its fog, but this isn't the romantic mist of postcards. This is a thick, yellow-green soup of coal smoke and river damp so dense you can't see your own outstretched hand. It seeps into your clothes, your lungs, and your home, coating everything in a greasy film. Pedestrians get lost on familiar streets, carriages crash, and the death toll quietly climbs every time the air goes still. They call it a pea souper, which makes it sound almost cosy, right up until you start coughing up something the same colour. The cause is no mystery: coal, and an enormous amount of it. Every home burns coal for heat and cooking. Every factory belches it from towering chimneys, and the whole vast city exhales a continuous cloud of soot and sulphurous smoke into the air. On a breezy day, the wind carries it off, but when the air goes still and cold and damp, especially in autumn and winter, the smoke mingles with the natural river fog and settles over the streets in a thick, motionless blanket that can last for days. The colour alone tells you something has gone wrong with the world. This is not the soft white mist of a country morning, but a sickly yellow-green or dirty brown, tinted by the chemicals it carries. It dims the sun to a feeble orange disk or blots it out entirely, turning midday into a strange perpetual twilight. Street lamps are lit at noon and barely make a dent. The whole city takes on the muffled, dreamlike quality of a place where the ordinary rules of light and distance have quietly stopped applying. Moving through it is genuinely disorienting. The fog can grow so dense that you truly cannot see your own hand held out before you, and people become hopelessly lost on streets they've walked their entire lives. Pedestrians stumble into walls, into one another, occasionally off the edge of the river or a canal. Carriages and omnibuses crawl along blind, their drivers straining to see the horse in front of them, and collisions are common. Boys with torches sometimes earn a few coins leading travellers through the murk, their little flames swallowed almost instantly by the gloom. The fog doesn't stay politely outside either. It seeps in through every crack and gap, filling homes, shops and theatres with its haze. It settles a greasy film over the furniture, the curtains, the food. It works its way into your clothing and your hair, so you carry its sour, smoky smell with you long after you've come indoors. There is no escaping it. You simply live inside it until the weather finally shifts and the wind mercifully returns. And beneath the inconvenience lies a genuine and deadly menace. The fog is laced with the byproducts of all that burning coal, and breathing it day after day wreaks havoc on the lungs. During the worst and most persistent fogs, the death rate across the city climbs noticeably, as the elderly, the very young, and those with weak chests sicken and die. People cough up black phlegm, struggle for breath, and quietly succumb, the toll mounting in the background while the city carries on as best it can. The Victorians largely regarded the fog as a nuisance, and even, perversely, as a characteristic feature of their great metropolis, something almost to be proud of. The full understanding of just how lethal that air was would come later, after the era had passed, when far deadlier fogs finally forced the issue. For now, you wrap a scarf over your mouth, light a lamp against the gloom, and pick your way carefully through the yellow murk, trusting that you're heading roughly in the right direction. So you venture out into the great choking soup, one dim shape among many, the city reduced to a few feet of greasy visibility in every direction. It coats you, it chokes you, and it may very well be slowly killing you. But it's simply the air of Victorian London, and you breathe it because there is, quite literally, nothing else to breathe. Feeling thirsty? Proceed with caution. The water that comes from the pump, the well, or the river is very likely teeming with the byproducts of a city that dumps its sewage directly into the same water it drinks from. Cholera sweeps through neighbourhoods in waves, killing thousands, and for years nobody can agree on why. Some blame bad air, some blame moral failing, and almost nobody suspects the water until a clever doctor named John Snow starts connecting the dots around a single contaminated pump. Until then, every casual sip is a roll of the dice with very high stakes. The fundamental problem is one of geography and arithmetic. London's population explodes during the era, swelling into the millions, and all those people produce a staggering quantity of waste. The old cesspools and sewers, never designed for such numbers, overflow and empty into the rivers and streams, and those same rivers and streams feed the pumps and wells where people draw their drinking water. The city, in effect, drinks what it discards, then wonders why everyone keeps getting sick. It's a closed and deadly loop that nobody has quite worked out. The Thames itself becomes a vast open sewer, a slow brown river of effluent that grows fouler with every passing year. The smell rolls off the water and into the surrounding streets, and the wealthy who live nearby keep their windows shut and their handkerchiefs close. The situation reaches its grim climax in the Great Stink, a summer so hot and so foul that the stench from the river finally drives Parliament itself to act, draping its riverside windows in lime-soaked curtains and at last funding a proper sewer system. It took an assault on the noses of the powerful to achieve what years of dying among the poor could not. But long before the sewers are built, cholera arrives in repeated terrifying waves. The disease strikes fast and kills faster, with victims sometimes well at breakfast and dead by nightfall, ravaged by a violent illness that drains the body of fluid. Whole neighbourhoods are gripped by terror as the death carts roll through, and nobody can say with any confidence how the sickness spreads, or how to stop it. Families watch helplessly as it moves from house to house, and the only certainty is that more will fall. The prevailing theory blames bad air, the so-called miasma, the foul-smelling vapours rising from the filth and the river. It's an understandable mistake, since the worst-smelling places do tend to be the sickest, but it points everyone in entirely the wrong direction. Others, less charitably, blame the poor themselves, suggesting that cholera is a punishment for moral weakness or dirty living, a comforting notion for those who'd rather not examine the water supply too closely. It takes the careful, patient work of a physician named John Snow to begin unravelling the truth. During an outbreak, he maps the deaths around a particular neighbourhood and notices they cluster tightly around a single public water pump on Broad Street. By tracing the pattern, he makes the case that the contaminated water, not the air, is carrying the disease. The famous removal of the pump handle becomes a turning point, a quiet act that helped point the way toward the truth, even as the old miasma believers clung stubbornly to their vapours. The full acceptance of his findings and the great works of sanitation that followed took time. For much of the era, the average person had no way of knowing that the clear, ordinary-looking water in their cup might be carrying death. So you'd fill your glass, drink it down, and trust to luck, never suspecting that the most dangerous thing in the house was the perfectly innocent-looking water you drank to stay alive. So you've fallen ill, which in Victorian England is practically a guarantee. Off to the doctor, where medical science is a thrilling blend of genuine progress and confident nonsense. You might be bled, blistered, or dosed with mercury, all delivered with great authority. The pharmacy shelf is a parade of horrors: cocaine for toothache, opium for crying babies, and arsenic for, well, complexion. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, is handed out for everything from headaches to grief, and sold without a single question. The cure, more often than not, is considerably more dangerous than whatever sent you there. Begin with the practice of bloodletting, a treatment so old and so trusted that it lingered well into the era despite doing precisely nothing useful. The theory held that many illnesses stemmed from an excess or imbalance in the body, and that draining off some blood would restore the patient to health. So you'd be opened with a small blade or set upon by leeches, those obliging little creatures, and relieved of a quantity of the very blood you needed to recover. The weaker you felt afterward was sometimes taken as proof the treatment was working, which is a logic best not examined too closely. Then there were the blisters and the purges, the deliberate raising of sores on the skin, or the forced emptying of the bowels and stomach, all in the name of drawing out the badness. A patient already weakened by illness would be further drained, blistered, and purged until very little was left, and the body was expected to somehow rally from this assistance. Mercury, a substance we now know to be genuinely poisonous, was a favoured remedy, prescribed for all manner of ailments and slowly poisoning the patient with every confident dose. The pharmacy, or the chemist's shop, was a wonderland of substances that would horrify a modern observer. Cocaine was sold freely as a remedy for toothache and a pick-me-up for low spirits. Opium in various forms was the great cure-all of the age, dispensed for pain, for coughs, for sleeplessness, and for the general business of getting through a difficult life. Arsenic, that classic poison, was taken in small doses to improve the complexion, lending the skin a fashionable pallor while quietly undermining the body that wore it. The undisputed king of the medicine cabinet was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, cheap, potent, and available to anyone with a few coins. It was taken for headaches, for nervous complaints, for grief, for the simple inability to cope, and it was given freely to fretful, teething, or simply inconvenient babies to keep them quiet. The consequences, a population quietly dependent on opium and a grim toll of infant deaths from overdose, were rarely connected to the soothing brown bottle on the shelf. Patent medicines flooded the market too, bottled concoctions with grand names and grander promises, sold by travelling showmen and respectable chemists alike. Each claimed to cure a dizzying range of ailments, and each contained some unpredictable mix of alcohol, opium, and whatever else the maker fancied. With no real regulation, the desperate and the hopeful poured their money into these cures, swallowing mystery liquids on the strength of a confident advertisement. To be fair, the era was not without genuine progress. The arrival of anaesthesia transformed surgery. The slow acceptance of antiseptic practice began to save countless lives, and the understanding of disease crept steadily forward. But this progress sat awkwardly alongside the bloodletting, the mercury and the laudanum, so that a patient's fate often depended on whether their particular doctor leaned toward the new science or the old confident nonsense. So you'd present yourself to the doctor, place your trust in his authority, and submit to whatever the day's wisdom prescribed. You might be cured, you might be poisoned, and you might simply be relieved of blood and money in equal measure. In Victorian England, falling ill was dangerous, but seeking treatment could be every bit as perilous. As evening falls, let's talk about light, because the dark is closing in fast. If you're poor, you've got tallow candles made from animal fat that smoke, sputter, and smell faintly of a butcher's shop. The better off enjoy oil lamps, and the truly modern have gas lighting piped into the walls, which is wonderful right up until it leaks, poisons the room, or explodes. Reading after dark strains the eyes, sewing is a squint-fueled ordeal, and the corners of every room stay shrouded in shadow. The age of the light switch is decades away, and your evenings are governed entirely by flame. Start at the bottom of the lighting ladder with the tallow candle, the humble light source of the poor. Made from rendered animal fat, it produces a dim, unsteady flame, drips constantly, and fills the room with a greasy smoke and the unmistakable odour of a slaughterhouse. The wick needs frequent trimming, or the flame gutters and smokes worse still, and the whole thing burns down quickly, demanding a steady supply you can scarcely afford. By its meagre glow you eat, work, and try to see, squinting through the gloom at whatever needs doing. A step up brings the beeswax candle, cleaner burning, brighter, and far more pleasant smelling, but expensive enough to remain a luxury reserved for churches, the wealthy and special occasions. For the household of modest means, the oil lamp becomes the light of choice, burning whale oil or later paraffin and casting a steadier, brighter glow than any candle. The lamps need regular filling, their wicks need trimming, and their glass chimneys need constant cleaning of soot. But they represent a genuine improvement, a pool of reliable light around which the evening can gather. For the modern and the prosperous, the marvel of the age is gas lighting. Pipes carry coal gas directly into the home, feeding fixtures on the walls that burn with a bright, steady flame at the turn of a tap. It transforms the rooms it lights, banishing shadows and extending the useful hours of the day, and it spreads through the streets too, the new gas lamps making the city navigable after dark in a way it never was before. It feels like the future arriving, a clean and effortless light at one's fingertips. But gaslighting carries its own quiet dangers. The flames consume the oxygen in a closed room and produce fumes that leave occupants with headaches and a vague sickness, and a leak in the pipes can fill a house with poisonous explosive gas. A forgotten tap or a guttered flame might let the gas seep silently into a sleeping household, and the open flame meeting that accumulated gas could end in a sudden, devastating explosion. The bright new convenience demanded a wary respect. Whatever your source of light, the fundamental truth of the Victorian evening is that it is dim. Even a well-lit room of the period would strike us as gloomy, the light pooling around each flame and the corners retreating into deep shadow. Reading, sewing, and any fine work after dark become an eye-straining labour, and many a Victorian ruined their sight squinting at small print by inadequate flame. The darkness shapes the rhythm of life, drawing people early to bed and limiting what can be done once the sun goes down. The whole arrangement also carries a constant whiff of danger, since every light is a live flame in a home full of fabric, wood, and flowing skirts. House fires are common, and a knocked-over lamp or a stray spark can turn a home to ash in minutes. You learn to handle your light with care, to snuff it before sleep, and to keep it well away from anything that might catch. So as night descends, you light your candle, your lamp, or your hissing gas jet, and you make do with the small, flickering circle of brightness it provides. The electric light that will one day banish the dark with the flick of a switch is still a distant dream, and for now your evenings belong entirely to the fragile, dangerous, ever-present flame. Let's go below stairs, where an invisible army keeps every comfortable household running. If you're a servant, your day starts at 5 in the morning and ends whenever your employers decide they no longer need you, which could be midnight. You haul coal, scrub floors on your knees, empty chamber pots, and tiptoe through the house trying not to be seen, because a good servant is meant to be functionally invisible. Your wages are tiny, your half-day off is rare, and your bedroom is a freezing attic. Still, it beats the workhouse, which is a phrase you'll be muttering quite a lot. Domestic service was one of the largest forms of employment in the era, especially for young women, and the household it served ran on a strict and elaborate hierarchy. At the top stood the butler and the housekeeper, dignified figures with real authority below stairs, and beneath them descended a whole ladder of footmen, cooks, housemaids, kitchen maids, and the lowly maid of all work, who in a smaller household did absolutely everything herself. Each rank knew its place, its duties, and precisely whom it could order about, and the whole structure mirrored in miniature the rigid class system of the world outside. The day began long before the family stirred. The lowest servants rose in the cold and the dark to rake out the grates, lay and light the fires, haul coal and water through the house, and set everything in order before their employers so much as opened their eyes. The household was meant to run as if by magic, the fires lit, the rooms warm, the breakfast ready, with no visible sign of the human labour that produced it. A servant who was caught in the act of this labour, or worse, seen lounging, had failed at the central rule of the role. That central rule was invisibility. A good servant was to be present and yet unseen, gliding through the house attending to its needs without intruding upon the family's awareness. There were back staircases and service corridors built precisely so that servants could move about without crossing paths with their betters. You learned to flatten yourself against the wall, to keep your eyes down, to speak only when spoken to, and to perform the endless work of the household as though it accomplished itself. And the work was endless. Floors were scrubbed on hands and knees, fireplaces blacked and polished, carpets beaten, silver cleaned, laundry boiled and wrung and mangled by hand, chamber pots emptied, meals prepared and served and cleared, all of it repeated day after day with no machinery to ease the burden. The hours stretched from before dawn until the family retired, and a servant's time was never truly their own, since they might be summoned by a bell at any moment. For all this, the wages were small, paid quarterly or even yearly, though servants did at least receive food and a roof, which counted for a great deal in a hard world. The roof, however, was usually a cramped, unheated attic room, freezing in winter and stifling in summer, shared with another servant and a long way from any comfort. Time off was meagre, perhaps a half-day a week or a single day a month if the household was generous, barely enough to visit family or simply rest. A servant's whole position depended on the goodwill of the employer and on maintaining a spotless character. Dismissal without a reference could be ruinous, since no respectable household would take on a servant who couldn't prove good conduct, and the alternatives to service were grim indeed. So you held your tongue, did your work, and endured the long hours and the slights, mindful always of the workhouse waiting for those who fell through the cracks. So spare a thought for the servant, up before dawn and working past dark, hauling and scrubbing and tiptoeing through a house that pretended not to see them. They were the quiet engine of every comfortable Victorian home, and their reward was a tiny wage, a freezing attic, and the cold comfort that, whatever their lot, at least it wasn't the workhouse. Now let's consider what's expected of women. because the Victorians had extremely firm opinions. The ideal woman is the angel in the house, gentle, pious, endlessly patient, and devoted entirely to her husband and children. She's meant to make the home a serene refuge from the harsh world, while having no legal rights to property, custody, or, for much of the era, her own earnings. Education is limited, ambition is unseemly, and a strong opinion is practically scandalous. Whether you're scrubbing a tenement floor or arranging flowers in a drawing room, the message is the same. Be quiet, be good, and be useful. The phrase itself comes from a popular poem of the age, and it captured perfectly the era's ideal of womanhood. The angel in the house was selfless to the point of self-erasure, putting the needs of husband and children always before her own, suffering in silence, and creating within the home a calm and morally pure sanctuary. The world of business and politics outside was considered harsh and corrupting, a male domain, and the woman's sacred task was to make the home a soft refuge from it, presiding over the hearth like a gentle guardian spirit. This ideal rested upon the doctrine of separate spheres, the firm belief that men and women were suited by nature to entirely different worlds. Man belonged to the public sphere of work, commerce, and public life, while woman belonged to the private sphere of home and family. To cross these boundaries was to violate the natural order, so a woman who sought a career, a voice in politics or independence of any kind, was regarded as unnatural, unwomanly, and faintly alarming. Her power was meant to be moral and domestic, exercised quietly within the walls of the home. The legal reality underpinning this ideal was stark. For much of the era, a married woman had almost no rights of her own. Upon marriage, her property, her money, and even her own earnings became her husband's, under a legal principle that effectively erased her separate existence. She could not easily divorce, and if a marriage did dissolve, the children belonged by law to the father. A wife was, in the eyes of the law, very nearly the property of her husband, dependent upon his goodwill for nearly everything. Education for girls reflected and reinforced these limits. A respectable young lady was taught the accomplishments, thought to make her a pleasing wife and hostess. A little music, a little drawing, some French, fine needlework and graceful manners, while serious intellectual study was considered unnecessary and even harmful, liable to strain the delicate female mind or make a girl unmarriageable. Ambition was unseemly, cleverness was to be hidden, and a strong opinion forcefully expressed was a social misstep of the first order. For women of the working classes, of course, the gentle ideal collided headlong with brutal necessity. These women laboured in factories, in fields, in other people's homes and in their own, scrubbing and cooking and child-rearing on top of paid work, because their families could not survive otherwise. The angel in the house was in truth a luxury of the comfortable classes, an ideal held up for all but achievable, only by those who could afford a life of domestic leisure. The poor woman was expected to embody the same modesty and virtue, while working herself to exhaustion. And yet, across the era, women pushed steadily against these confines. Reformers campaigned for the right of married women to own property, for access to education and the professions, and, gathering force toward the century's end, for the right to vote. Writers, nurses and activists carved out public roles in the teeth of disapproval, and the rigid ideal slowly began to crack under the weight of women who simply refused to be silent. So whatever your station, the message pressed upon you was the same: to be gentle, good, modest, and useful, to want little for yourself, and to find your whole purpose in the service of others. It was a beautiful, suffocating ideal, and the women who lived within it, and those who fought their way out, were a great deal stronger than the era ever gave them credit for. Let's talk about romance. conducted under a rulebook thicker than a Bible. Courtship is a carefully chaperoned affair where a young couple can barely be alone in the same room, let alone unsupervised. Feelings are communicated through coded gestures, calling cards, and the language of flowers, because saying anything directly would be far too forward. Marriage is as much about money, class, and respectability as it is about love, and a wrong move, a rumour, or a single unguarded moment can ruin a reputation forever. It's the most high-stakes, low-contact dating scene in history. It begins with a question of who one is even permitted to court, and here class draws firm and largely unyielding lines. A young person was expected to find a match within their own social rank, or, ideally, slightly above it, and a romance that crossed too far up or down the social ladder met with stiff family resistance. Marriage was understood to be a serious matter of property, alliance, and respectability, far too important to be left entirely to the unreliable whims of the heart. Parents, family, and the watchful eyes of society all had a stake in who paired with whom. Once a suitable acquaintance was made, the rituals of courtship unfolded with all the relaxed spontaneity of a military campaign. A gentleman might call upon a young lady at her family home, but never alone, for a chaperone was nearly always present, a mother, an aunt, an older sibling, ensuring that the couple was never left unsupervised. To be alone together, even briefly, could compromise a young woman's reputation beyond repair, so the courting pair conducted their entire romance under the steady gaze of a third party. Since plain speech was considered far too bold, lovers developed an elaborate vocabulary of indirect communication. The language of flowers allowed a suitor to send an entire message in a carefully chosen bouquet, each bloom carrying its own meaning of love, devotion, or rejection. There were codes in the way a fan was held, in the giving and receiving of calling cards, in the careful wording of a chaperoned conversation. A great deal could be said without anything improper ever being spoken aloud, and a young woman skilled in these codes could encourage or discourage a suitor with the subtlest of signals. The stakes of all this caution were enormous, particularly for women whose entire futures could hinge upon their reputations. A single rumour, a moment of indiscretion, a letter that fell into the wrong hands, or an unchaperoned encounter could brand a young woman as fast or fallen and end her marriage prospects entirely. With so few respectable paths open to women besides marriage, a ruined reputation was not merely embarrassing, but potentially catastrophic, threatening to consign her to spinsterhood or worse. For the man, the path to marriage also ran heavily through questions of money and prospects. A gentleman was generally expected to be able to support a wife and household in the appropriate style before he could reasonably propose, which meant many men married late, having first established themselves financially. A formal proposal, once a couple reached that point, often involved the suitor seeking the permission of the lady's father, the whole matter handled with a gravity befitting a treaty between nations. The engagement, once secured, brought a slight loosening of the rules, allowing the couple a little more freedom in each other's company, though propriety still reigned. The betrothal was a serious commitment, not lightly broken, and a man who jilted a woman might even face a legal action for breach of promise. Such was the weight placed upon a pledge to marry. So romance in Victorian England was a slow, formal and heavily supervised dance, hedged about with rules, codes and the ever-present threat of scandal. Love existed, certainly, and many couples found genuine affection within the constraints, but they pursued it through coded flowers and chaperoned visits, every step watched, every word weighed. It was without question the most cautious and high-stakes courtship the world had ever devised. With marriage comes children, and childbirth in Victorian England is a genuinely dangerous business. There's no reliable pain relief for much of the era, infection is rampant, and doctors who move from patient to patient rarely think to wash their hands. Mothers die in alarming numbers, and so do their babies, with infant mortality so high that families often lose several children before any reach adulthood. Grief is woven into daily life, mourned with elaborate ritual and quiet endurance. You're expected to have many children precisely because you may not keep them all, which is as bleak as it sounds. For much of the era, the business of giving birth fell to a midwife, often an experienced local woman, attending the mother at home in her own bed. As the century wore on, doctors increasingly took over the management of childbirth, particularly among those who could afford them, bringing with them new instruments and new confidence, though not always better outcomes. Either way, the experience was an ordeal faced largely without the comforts and safeguards we would consider essential, in a time when so much about the body remained mysterious. The great unseen killer was infection, and the tragedy was that so much of it was carried in by the very people meant to help. Doctors and surgeons moved from patient to patient, from the dissecting room to the birthing bed, without washing their hands, having no understanding that they were carrying invisible agents of disease on their fingers. The result was childbed fever, a deadly infection that swept through maternity wards and claimed the lives of countless women in the days after they gave birth, often striking hardest precisely where medical attention was most concentrated. Pain relief, for most of the period, simply did not exist in any reliable form, and a woman endured the full agony of labour with little more than the support of those around her and her own endurance. The arrival of chloroform offered a glimpse of mercy, and its use gained acceptance and respectability after it was famously administered to the Queen herself during a royal birth. Even then, the relief reached only some, and many women continued to labour without it. The experience as harrowing as it had always been. When the mother survived, the danger shifted to the child, and here the numbers grow truly grim. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, with a heartbreaking proportion of babies dying in their first year of life, carried off by infectious disease, poor sanitation, contaminated food and water, and the simple frailty of newborns in a hostile world. The poorest districts saw the worst of it, where overcrowding and filth turned the early months of life into a desperate gamble. This constant presence of death shaped the entire experience of family life. Families had many children in part because they expected to lose some, and few households escaped the era without burying at least one child. Parents grieved, of course, and grieved deeply, but they grieved within a society where the death of a child was a common and expected sorrow, mourned with the elaborate rituals the Victorians brought to all their dealings with death. Those rituals were extensive. The dead, including infants, were mourned with black clothing, with memorial keepsakes, and sometimes with photographs taken of the lost child posed peacefully, a practice that strikes us as macabre, but that offered grieving families a precious final image of one they had loved. Grief was not hidden but formalised, given shape and expression through custom, which perhaps offered some comfort in the face of losses so frequent and so painful. As the era progressed, slow improvements began to turn the tide. The growing acceptance of antiseptic methods, the gradual improvement of sanitation, and a deepening understanding of disease began, in time, to make both childbirth and infancy less lethal. But these advances came unevenly and late, and for vast numbers of Victorian families, the arrival of a child remained a moment shadowed by real and present danger. So the joy of new life in Victorian England came shadowed always by the fear of losing it, for mother and child alike. Families grew large in the knowledge that not all would survive, and grief became a familiar visitor woven quietly into the fabric of ordinary life. It is a sobering thought, and one worth remembering the next time we marvel at the simple, ordinary survival we so easily take for granted. Let's return to the dinner table, because we need to discuss what you're really eating. Food adulteration is rampant, and there's almost no regulation to stop it. Your sugar is bulked out with sand, your pepper with floor sweepings, your candy coloured with toxic dyes, and your beer possibly laced with strychnine to sharpen the taste. Sausages contain mysteries best left unexamined. Even the bread, that humble staple, may be whitened with chalk or alum to look more appetising. Every meal is a small act of faith, and your stomach has simply learned to stop asking questions. The root of the problem is a marketplace running almost entirely on the honour system, with no inspectors, no labelling laws, and no meaningful penalties to keep the dishonest in check. A grocer or manufacturer who could stretch his product with a cheap filler or brighten it with a cheap dye stood to make more money, and in a competitive trade the temptation proved overwhelming. The result was a food supply riddled with substances that range from the merely fraudulent to the genuinely poisonous, all of it served up to a public with no easy way of telling the difference. Consider the everyday staples. Bread, the foundation of so many tables, was routinely whitened and bulked with alum, a substance that made an inferior loaf look appealingly pale, while offering nothing of nourishment and potentially harming digestion. Flour was cut with chalk, or even ground bone. Tea leaves were dried, dyed and resold, sometimes tinted with metallic compounds to restore a convincing colour. Coffee was padded out with chicory, roasted grain, and worse. The simple act of stocking a pantry was, unknowingly, an exercise in collecting adulterated goods. The seasonings and luxuries fared no better. Pepper was bulked with floor sweepings and other ground-up rubbish. Sugar was mixed with sand to add cheap weight, and mustard was stretched with flour and brightened with dye. Sweets and candies, beloved by children, were among the most dangerous of all, coloured with vivid pigments that frequently contained genuinely toxic substances like lead and copper. A child sucking on a brightly coloured sweet might be ingesting a small dose of poison along with the sugar, and tragic cases of poisoning from contaminated confectionery did occur. Drink was a particular minefield. Milk was watered down to stretch the supply, then thickened back to a convincing consistency with chalk, and in the worst cases dosed with substances to mask the fact that it had begun to spoil. Beer, that staple of the working man, was sometimes adulterated with bitter and dangerous additives to fake the taste of strength or hops, including, in the most alarming reports, substances no one should ever willingly drink. Wine and spirits were watered, fortified, and faked with abandon. The meat trade hid its own horrors, with sausages and pies offering a convenient way to dispose of meat that was old, diseased, or otherwise unfit, all of it minced, spiced, and disguised beyond recognition. The squeamish learned not to ask too closely what went into the cheaper cuts and the mystery pies sold on the street, and the hungry, having little choice, ate them anyway and hoped for the best. Change came, as it so often did, slowly, and only after considerable suffering and scandal. Determined campaigners and pioneering analysts began testing food and publishing their alarming findings, exposing just how widespread and dangerous the adulteration had become. Their work, alongside mounting public outrage, eventually pushed reluctant lawmakers toward the first real food safety legislation, establishing standards and inspections that gradually drove the worst practices out of business. But for most of the era, the ordinary diner had no protection but luck and a strong constitution. So you sat down to your meal trusting that the bread was bread and the milk was milk, blissfully unaware of the chalk, the alum, the sand and the dye that had found their way onto your plate. Every meal was a quiet gamble, and your long-suffering stomach, having no better option, simply learned to cope and ask no questions at all. Step out into the street and watch your shoes. The roads are a churning mixture of mud, horse manure, rotting refuse, and the occasional dead animal. All of it stirred together by thousands of hooves and wheels. Crossing sweepers, often ragged children, clear a path through the muck for a coin. Street vendors hawk everything from hot eels to second-hand teeth. Beggars work the corners, and pickpockets work the crowds. It's loud, chaotic, and pungent beyond description. The Victorian street is alive with commerce, desperation, and a smell that you will, eventually and tragically, stop noticing. The most immediate fact of the street is what lies underfoot, and it is rarely pleasant. The city moves on horsepower, quite literally, and the thousands upon thousands of horses pulling carts, cabs and omnibuses produce a staggering quantity of manure, dropped continuously onto the roads. Mix that with mud, rain, rotting vegetable scraps, household waste flung from windows, and the occasional carcass of a horse that is simply dropped dead in its traces, and you have a churning surface stew that coats every boot and hem that ventures into it. This is where the crossing sweepers come in. An army of mostly children and the very poor who station themselves at street corners and sweep a clear path through the muck for pedestrians, hoping for a coin in return. It is a precarious and humble living, performed in all weathers amid the filth, but for a child with no other prospects, it is a way to earn a few pennies and stay one small step from begging. They are a fixture of every busy crossing, broom in hand, eyes hopeful, clearing the way for those who can spare a coin. Above the filth, the street roars with commerce. Street vendors, the costermongers, cry their wares in a deafening chorus, selling fruit, vegetables, hot pies, eels, chestnuts, and 1,000 other things from barrows and trays. There are sellers of second-hand clothes, of matches, of ballads and broadsheets, of bootlaces and trinkets, and even, in a grim echo of the dentures trade, sellers of second-hand teeth. The street is one vast, chaotic, open-air market, every voice competing to be heard above the din of wheels and hooves and the press of the crowd. Among the legitimate trade moves a shadow economy of desperation and crime. Beggars work the corners, displaying real or exaggerated afflictions to soften the hearts of passers-by. Pickpockets, often nimble children trained in the art, work the crowds with practised fingers, lifting purses and handkerchiefs from the unwary. The street is a place of opportunity for the honest and the dishonest alike, and the line between them often blurred in the face of grinding poverty. The noise of it all is relentless. The iron-shod wheels and hooves clatter and grind over cobblestones. The vendors shout, the crowds talk and argue, the church bells ring, and street musicians and performers add their own contributions to the cacophony. It is a wall of sound from dawn until well into the night, a constant roar that the city dweller learns to live inside, no longer truly hearing it. And over everything hangs the smell, a rich and complex perfume of horse manure, human waste, rotting refuse, coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and whatever happens to be cooking or decaying nearby. It is, by any modern reckoning, overpowering, and yet the remarkable adaptability of the human nose means that those who live amid it gradually cease to notice, their senses quietly surrendering to the inevitable. The newcomer reels, the resident strolls on, untroubled. So you make your way through this churning river of muck, noise and humanity, dodging the worst of the filth, fending off the pickpockets, perhaps tossing a coin to a crossing sweeper, and breathing through a smell you've thankfully stopped noticing. The Victorian street is filthy, chaotic, dangerous, and utterly alive. A place where fortunes are hawked and lost, where survival is a daily hustle, and where the whole teeming drama of the age plays out in the open air. Let's talk about crime, of which there is plenty. The poorer districts are a maze of dark alleys and rookeries where the law rarely ventures, and theft, violence and worse are everyday hazards. The newly formed police force, nicknamed Peelers or Bobbies, after Robert Peel, patrols in top hats and tailcoats, doing its best against impossible odds. Punishment is harsh and theatrical. Public hangings draw cheering crowds. Petty thieves are shipped off to the colonies, and prisons are grim, overcrowded and unforgiving. Justice in Victorian England is swift, severe, and not especially concerned with whether you actually did it. The breeding ground for much of the crime was the rookery, the dense, overcrowded slum districts where the poorest of the poor were packed into crumbling, filthy tenements, connected by a bewildering warren of dark alleys, courts and passages. These places were a world unto themselves, all but impenetrable to outsiders, where the desperate and the criminal could vanish in an instant and where the rule of law held little sway. Here, theft, violence, and every manner of vice flourished in the shadows, born of a poverty so grinding that crime often seemed the only alternative to starvation. Into this world, early in the era, came a genuine innovation, an organised professional police force. Established by Robert Peel, the new constables earned the nicknames Peelers and Bobbies from his name, and they patrolled the streets in their distinctive uniforms, top-hatted and tail-coated in the early days, a visible and deliberately non-military presence meant to prevent crime by their very watchfulness. It was a new idea, this notion of a standing force to keep public order, and it was met at first with suspicion before slowly becoming an accepted part of city life. The constables faced a daunting task, armed with little more than a truncheon and a rattle to summon help. They walked their beats through dangerous districts, confronting hardened criminals and angry mobs with scant support. The detection of crime was in its infancy, relying heavily on informants, confessions, and the patient pounding of pavement, since the scientific methods of later eras lay far in the future. They did their best against overwhelming odds, in a city where crime had deep roots and endless dark corners to hide in. When a criminal was caught, the punishment that followed was harsh, swift, and often staged as public spectacle. For the most serious crimes, the penalty was death by hanging, and for much of the early era these executions were carried out in public before large, boisterous crowds. Far from being solemn affairs, public hangings drew throngs of spectators who treated them almost as entertainment, a grim festival atmosphere surrounding the gallows, until growing unease eventually drove executions behind prison walls. For lesser crimes, a favoured punishment was transportation, the shipping of convicts across the world to penal colonies, a sentence that removed the offender from the country entirely and sent them to a hard life of labour in a distant land. Petty thieves, including children, might find themselves transported for offences that seemed trivial to modernise, banished across the seas for stealing food or goods of modest value. The colonies received a steady stream of the convicted, many of whom never saw home again. The prisons themselves were grim institutions, overcrowded, harsh, and designed to punish and deter rather than reform, though reformers did campaign across the era for better conditions and more humane treatment. New theories of imprisonment came and went, some emphasising silence and isolation, in the belief that solitary reflection would mend the criminal soul, others favouring hard, pointless labour as a corrective. For the inmate, whatever the prevailing theory, the experience was one of cold, hunger, and unrelenting severity. And justice itself was a blunt and uneven instrument, weighing heavily upon the poor while the comfortable classes navigated a system more inclined to favour them. Evidence could be thin, trials swift, and the presumption of innocence a far weaker shield than it is today, so that the unlucky or the friendless might find themselves convicted on slender grounds. The full weight of the law fell hardest on those least able to defend themselves, so crime and punishment in Victorian England were a harsh and theatrical business, a world of dark rookeries and dogged bobbies, of public hangings and convict ships, of grim prisons and rough justice. It was an age striving, however imperfectly, to impose order on a vast and unruly city, and the order it achieved was swift, severe, and not always overly concerned with whether the right person had been caught at all. For the truly desperate, there's the workhouse, a word that strikes fear into every poor heart. If you can't feed yourself, you can enter, but the conditions are made deliberately miserable to discourage anyone from relying on it. Families are separated on arrival, husbands from wives, parents from children. The food is meagre, the labour is pointless and grinding, and the uniforms strip away any last shred of dignity. It is charity designed to punish, a safety net woven from barbed wire. The phrase, "Do you want to end up in the workhouse?" hangs over every household like a threat, because for many it isn't one. The whole grim institution was built upon a particular philosophy of poverty, one that regarded the poor with deep suspicion and assumed that relief, if made too comfortable, would simply encourage idleness. The solution, enshrined in law, was the principle that life inside the workhouse must be made harsher than the worst life a labourer could scrape together outside it. Only by making relief thoroughly unpleasant, the thinking went, could the authorities ensure that only the truly desperate would ever ask for it. Misery, in other words, was not an accident of the workhouse but its deliberate design. Crossing the threshold meant submitting to a regime calculated to break the spirit. The first blow came at the door, with the separation of families. Husbands were divided from wives, parents from their children, the assumption being that the poor should be discouraged from breeding more poor, and that family bonds were a luxury the dependent could not be permitted. A husband and wife who entered together might catch only glimpses of one another thereafter, and a mother might be parted from her young children with little ceremony, a cruelty that wounded far deeper than hunger. Inside, life was stripped to a bleak and regimented routine. Inmates wore a coarse uniform that marked them as paupers and erased their individuality, ate meals of deliberate monotony and meagreness, and slept in plain dormitories under strict rules. The diet was calculated to provide just enough to sustain life, and not a morsel more. A thin gruel and bread existence designed around the principle that the food should never be appealing. Every detail of the day was governed by bells and overseers, leaving no room for choice, comfort, or dignity. The labour was perhaps the most soul-destroying feature of all. To earn their keep, inmates were set to hard, monotonous, and frequently pointless work, picking apart old rope into its fibres, a task called picking oakum that left the fingers raw, or breaking stones, or grinding corn, or crushing bones. The work was chosen not because it was useful, but because it was hard and tedious, a punishment dressed as employment, intended to instill the lesson that dependence came at a bitter cost. Within these walls lived the whole spectrum of the desperate, for the workhouse caught all those who could no longer survive outside it. The elderly with no family to support them, the sick, the disabled, the orphaned child, the abandoned mother, the labourer broken by injury or age, all ended up under the same harsh roof, lumped together and treated alike regardless of how they had come to such a pass. There was little distinction made between the unlucky and the supposedly idle, and all alike endured the same grinding regime. Small wonder, then, that the workhouse cast such a long shadow over the lives of the poor. It loomed in the imagination as the ultimate disgrace, the final destination for those who had failed to keep themselves afloat, and the dread of it drove people to extraordinary lengths to avoid it, enduring hunger, illness, and hardship rather than surrender themselves to its doors. The phrase ending up in the workhouse was no idle expression but a genuine terror. So for the Victorian poor, the safety net beneath them was not a comfort but a threat, a place of separation, deprivation, and deliberate humiliation that punished poverty as though it were a crime. It stood as a constant warning of how far one might fall, and it ensured that, for the desperate, even the worst life outside its walls was something to cling to with all one's strength. Let's discuss respectability, the invisible force governing everything you do. In Victorian England, how things appear matters enormously, perhaps more than how they actually are. You must dress correctly, speak correctly, attend church, and maintain a spotless reputation, because a single scandal can sink an entire family. Behind the lace curtains, of course, lies a roaring trade in vice, gossip, and hypocrisy, all of it carefully hidden behind a polished front door. The whole society runs on a delicate agreement to look respectable while quietly assuming everyone else is up to something. They usually are. Respectability was the great organising principle of Victorian middle-class life, a code of conduct and appearance that determined one's standing in the eyes of neighbours, employers, and society at large. To be respectable was to be accepted, trusted, and worthy of good company, while to lose respectability was to be cast out, shunned, and quietly excluded from the circles that mattered. It was a currency more valuable than money in some ways, since wealth without respectability counted for little, and it had to be constantly earned and displayed through the careful management of one's public face. The demands of this code reached into every corner of daily life. One was expected to dress according to one's station, neither too shabbily nor too grandly, to speak with the correct accent and vocabulary, to observe the elaborate rules of etiquette that governed visiting, dining, and conversation, and to attend church regularly as a visible sign of moral soundness. The home itself was a stage upon which respectability was performed, its front parlour kept immaculate and stocked with the proper ornaments and furnishings to impress any visitor who might be received there. Underpinning it all was reputation, that fragile and precious possession upon which a family's entire standing depended. A reputation, once damaged, was extraordinarily difficult to repair, and a single scandal could bring down not just an individual, but an entire family, tainting parents, children, and relations alike. A daughter's indiscretion, a son's debts, a whiff of dishonesty in business, or any of 100 other lapses could ruin years of careful effort in an instant, and so families guarded their good name with anxious vigilance. The pressure of all this fostered a society obsessed with surfaces in which the appearance of virtue mattered as much as, and often more than, virtue itself. What truly went on behind a respectable family's front door was a private matter, to be concealed at all costs from prying eyes, and a great deal could be hidden so long as the public face remained spotless. The neighbour's good opinion was the thing to protect, and as long as the curtain stayed drawn on one's private troubles, respectability could be maintained. And so, inevitably, the age became a byword for hypocrisy, a society that preached strict morality in public, while a thriving underworld of vice flourished just out of sight. The same city that condemned immodesty supported a vast trade in things never spoken of in polite company, and the same gentlemen who upheld the strictest standards by day might lead very different lives once the respectable hours had passed. The gap between the public ideal and the private reality yawned wide, papered over by a collective agreement not to look too closely. This collective performance bound everyone in a curious bargain, each person maintaining their own polished front while quietly suspecting that everyone else's was equally a facade. Gossip, naturally, was the great enforcer, the means by which the community policed its members, punished transgressions, and kept everyone anxiously attentive to appearances. A reputation could be undone by a whisper, and so the watchful eyes of neighbours and acquaintances kept everyone in line through the simple fear of being talked about. So the whole of respectable Victorian society moved through its days in an elaborate performance of propriety, each player dressed correctly, speaking correctly, and presenting an immaculate face to the world, while keeping its private failings firmly behind closed doors. It was a culture built upon appearances, sustained by reputation, and riddled with the quiet hypocrisy that such a system inevitably breeds. All of it held together by the unspoken understanding that one must, above all else, keep up appearances. After all that grimness, let's have some fun, because Victorians did know how to enjoy themselves. The working class packs into music halls for raucous songs, comedians and cheap beer, while the gin palaces glitter with mirrors and questionable decisions. The middle classes prefer the theatre, the lecture hall, or a respectable evening of parlour games and piano. Pubs are everywhere, and drinking is practically a national sport. For a few precious hours the soot and the struggle fade, and you can laugh, sing and forget that you have to be up before dawn to do it all again tomorrow. The great temple of working-class entertainment was the music hall, a boisterous, smoky venue where audiences crowded in to drink, eat, and be entertained by a rapid succession of performers. The bill might feature comic singers, dancers, acrobats, comedians and novelty acts, all delivered with a cheerful vulgarity that the respectable classes found alarming and the working classes found marvellous. The crowd was no passive spectator but a full participant, roaring along with the choruses of the popular songs, heckling, laughing, and turning the whole evening into a shared communal release from the grind of working life. Glittering alongside the music halls were the gin palaces, gaudy and brightly lit establishments dressed up with mirrors, polished brass and dazzling gaslight to lure in the thirsty and the weary. They offered cheap spirits in surroundings deliberately designed to seem a world apart from the drab and crowded homes of their patrons, a brief, glittering escape purchased by the glass. Drink, of course, was woven deeply into the fabric of life at every level of society, and the gin palace catered to a thirst that was both a genuine pleasure and, for many, a serious affliction that reformers railed against throughout the era. The pub, more modest and more ubiquitous than the gin palace, was the true centre of working-class social life, a warm and lively place to gather, talk, drink, and pass the evening in company. Nearly every street corner had one, and they served as meeting places, clubs, and refuges from cramped and cheerless lodgings. For the working man, and increasingly the working woman, the pub was where the community came together, and the consumption of beer and spirits was so universal as to be almost unremarkable. The middle and upper classes pursued their pleasures in more decorous surroundings. The theatre offered everything from grand productions of the classics to popular melodramas full of villains, heroines, and last-minute rescues, drawing audiences who came to be moved, thrilled, and entertained in comfortable respectability. There were concerts, opera, and the lecture hall, where the Victorian appetite for self-improvement could be indulged through edifying talks on science, travel, and the wonders of the age. Entertainment and education rolled neatly together. For the respectable family, much of the evening's amusement happened at home, in the parlour, gathered around the piano. Musical accomplishment was prized, and a daughter who could play and sing provided the centrepiece of many an evening's entertainment, the family and their guests joining in popular songs and ballads. There were parlour games of all kinds, charades and guessing games and word games, along with reading aloud, conversation, and the quiet pleasures of a sociable evening conducted entirely within the bounds of propriety. The era also saw the rise of new leisure pursuits that would have astonished earlier generations. The railways opened up travel, allowing day trips to the seaside and excursions to the countryside that had once been impossible for ordinary people. Spectator sports drew growing crowds, museums and exhibitions invited the curious, and the great public parks offered space to stroll and breathe in cities otherwise short of both. Leisure was slowly becoming something the masses could share, not merely a privilege of the idle rich. So for all its hardship, Victorian England knew how to set its troubles aside and enjoy itself, whether in the raucous warmth of the music hall, the glitter of the gin palace, the drama of the theatre, or the gentle pleasures of the parlour piano. For a few precious hours beneath the gaslight, the soot and the struggle could be forgotten, and you could laugh and sing and feel just briefly that life was something more than the long grind awaiting you at dawn. Let's turn, as the Victorians so loved to, toward death. With disease everywhere and medicine unreliable, death is a constant presence, and the era responds by turning grief into an elaborate art form. Widows wear black for years, jewellery is woven from the hair of the deceased, and photographs are taken of the dead posed as if merely sleeping. Funerals are grand, expensive affairs, and an entire industry springs up to supply the mourning clothes, the crepe and the keepsakes. It's morbid, theatrical, and oddly tender. A society so familiar with loss that it dressed it up in its very finest clothes. Death was simply a far more present and familiar companion than it is to us today, woven into the ordinary fabric of life by disease, by dangerous work, by deadly childbirth, and by an infant mortality that touched nearly every family. People died at home, surrounded by their relations, and the dead were laid out and watched over in the house before burial, so that death was something seen and handled directly rather than hidden away. In such a world, the rituals surrounding death took on enormous importance, offering structure and meaning in the face of constant loss. Mourning in particular became an elaborate and codified affair, governed by strict rules that dictated how the bereaved should dress and behave, and for how long. A widow was bound by the most demanding code of all, expected to retreat into deep mourning for an extended period, clothing herself entirely in black, in dull fabrics like crepe that reflected no light, and withdrawing from society before gradually, over months and years, easing into lesser stages of mourning. The exact rules covered every relation, prescribing the depth and duration of grief one owed to a husband, a parent, a child, or a distant cousin. This culture of mourning gave rise to an entire industry devoted to supplying its needs. Specialist shops sold mourning clothes, black-bordered stationery, and all the sombre accessories the bereaved required, and the funeral trade flourished, providing everything from the coffin and the hearse to the plumed horses and professional mourners who lent a funeral its proper grandeur. A respectable funeral was an expensive undertaking, and families would spend heavily, sometimes ruinously, to see their dead off in the appropriate style. For to scrimp on a funeral was a shameful failure of respect. Among the most striking and, to modernise, most poignant of the era's customs was the keeping of mementos of the dead. Mourning jewellery was crafted, sometimes incorporating the actual hair of the deceased woven into intricate designs, so that a lock of a loved one's hair might be worn close, set into a brooch or a ring. These keepsakes kept the departed physically present in some small way, a tangible link to those who had been lost, treasured and worn as both ornament and memorial. Perhaps the most haunting practice of all was the post-mortem photograph. Photography was new and expensive, and for many poor families a photograph taken of a deceased relative, often a child, might be the only image they would ever possess of them. The dead were carefully posed, sometimes arranged to appear merely asleep, sometimes surrounded by living family members to create a final, precious likeness. To us these images seem macabre, but to the grieving they were a treasured comfort, a way of holding on to a beloved face that would otherwise be lost forever. Presiding over the whole culture of mourning was the Queen herself, whose profound and prolonged grief after the death of her beloved husband set the tone for the entire nation. Her decision to withdraw and to wear mourning for the rest of her long life lent the era's sombre customs the highest possible example, and her sorrow became, in a sense, the sorrow of the age, reinforcing the deep seriousness with which the Victorians approached the business of grief. So the Victorians met the constant presence of death not by looking away but by embracing it, surrounding it with ritual, ornament and elaborate ceremony. They wore their grief upon their bodies, kept the dead close in hair and photograph, and spent freely to honour the departed. It was morbid, certainly, and theatrical beyond measure, but beneath the black crape and the plumed hearses lay something tender and deeply human, a society that loved its dead and refused to let them go quietly. And so we come to the end of your Victorian day. You've woken in the cold, dodged the chamber pot, eaten food of dubious origin, laced yourself nearly in half, breathed in air you could chew, drunk water that may yet finish you off, and worked until your bones ached, all while maintaining a perfectly respectable expression. The Victorian age gave us railways, novels, and wonders of invention, but it built them on the backs of people who endured a daily grind that would flatten most of us in an afternoon. Beneath the gas lamps and the lace, behind the politeness and the parlours, life was hard, brief, and astonishingly resilient. Consider all that a single ordinary day asked of you. You rose before dawn in an unheated room, washed from a basin in cold water, dressed in layers that constricted and chafed, and ate a breakfast that may have been quietly adulterated with chalk or alum. You faced the chamber pot or the shared privy, ventured out into streets thick with filth and noise, and breathed an air laced with coal smoke and worse. And all of this was merely the prelude, the small indignities you endured before the real labour of the day even began. The Victorian age has come down to us draped in romance, all crinolines and candlelight, gallant gentlemen and demure ladies, cosy parlours and gaslit charm. But that polished image is a costume, and beneath it lay a reality that was grittier, harder, and far more dangerous than the picture postcards suggest. For every elegant drawing room there were 100 cramped tenements, for every grand ball 1,000 12-hour shifts, and for every refined accomplishment a vast and uncelebrated labour that kept the comfortable world turning. And yet, for all its hardships, the era was a genuine engine of transformation, an age of astonishing invention and progress that reshaped the world. The railways shrank the country and remade how people lived and travelled. The factories, for all their cruelty, produced goods and wealth on a scale never before imagined. Great strides were made in science, in medicine, in literature, in the slow and hard-won expansion of rights and reforms. The Victorians built much of the modern world, and they built it at tremendous human cost. That cost fell, as it so often does, most heavily upon those least able to bear it, the factory workers and the servants, the climbing boys and the scavengers, the women labouring under impossible expectations, and the poor forever haunted by the shadow of the workhouse. They are the ones who powered the great machine of the age, and they did so largely unthanked and unremembered, their endurance the hidden foundation beneath the era's celebrated achievements. Their lives were hard and frequently short, and yet they pressed on. What stays with you, in the end, is not just the suffering, but the sheer resilience of people who met such a world and refused to be broken by it. They woke each cold morning, faced each grinding day, buried their dead with dignity, found their snatches of joy in the music hall and the parlour, and somehow kept going, kept hoping, kept building lives of meaning amid hardship we can scarcely imagine. There is something profoundly moving in that stubborn, ordinary courage. So tonight, as you settle into a warm bed in a heated home, with clean water from the tap and light at the touch of a switch, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the Victorians who came before. They drank the dangerous water, breathed the poisoned air, laced themselves into discomfort, and laboured through the dark so that the comforts we take for granted might one day come to be. They endured what would flatten us, and they did it with a resilience that built the modern world. History, after all, is gross and exhausting and frequently unjust, but it is also proof of how stubborn, hopeful, and quietly heroic ordinary people can be. And on that thought, let your eyes grow heavy, let the gas lamps dim, and let the long Victorian day fade gently to black. Sleep well. Let's talk about laundry, an undertaking so vast and so dreaded that it consumed entire days and broke entire backs. If you imagine tossing your clothes into a machine and wandering off to do something pleasant, banish the thought, because in Victorian England, washing the household linen is a brutal, all-consuming labour that turns one woman's week into a steaming, scrubbing ordeal. There are no buttons to press, no detergents in cheerful bottles, only water, fire, harsh soap, and the unyielding strength of a pair of human arms. By the end of it, you'll never look at a clean shirt the same way again. It begins, as everything in this era seems to, with water and the heroic business of getting it. The water must be hauled, bucket by heavy bucket, from a pump or a well, then heated over the fire in great coppers until it boils, a process that fills the room with billowing steam and turns the whole house into a sweltering damp cavern. On wash day, the kitchen becomes a fog of heat and vapour, the walls running with condensation, and you labour in the thick of it, sleeves rolled and face flushed, before a single garment has even been touched. Then comes the scrubbing, the true heart of the misery. Each item is rubbed by hand against a ridged washboard with soap so harsh it strips the grease from the cloth and the skin from your knuckles in equal measure. The heavily soiled linens are pounded, twisted, and worked until your shoulders burn and your hands turn red and raw. Stubborn stains demand their own special tortures, soaking and bleaching and rubbing, and there is no shortcut and no mercy, only the relentless repetition of scrub, rinse and wring, garment after garment after garment. The whites get a particularly gruelling treatment, boiled in the copper to lift the dirt and brighten the cloth, then often stiffened afterward with starch made from boiled down flour or potatoes. The starching and the ironing that followed were arts in themselves, the irons heated on the stove, hefted, applied, and swapped for a hotter one the moment they cooled, the laundress judging the temperature by holding the iron near her cheek and praying she didn't scorch the very thing she had spent all day cleaning. And then, having washed and wrung this small mountain of sodden fabric, you must dry it, which in the perpetually damp and smoky air is its own special torment. Hung outdoors, the washing risks a sudden shower or a coating of soot from the ever-present coal smoke that can undo a whole day's work in an instant. Hung indoors, it festoons the home with dripping garments for days, draping every surface and adding still more damp to a house already swimming in it. The clean smell of fresh linen was, in this world, very hard one indeed. For the poorest, who could not spare the fuel or the space, there were public wash-houses where women gathered to labour side by side, and for those slightly better off, the dreaded work might be sent out to a professional washerwoman, one of the era's hardest and least rewarded trades. These women spent their lives bent over steaming tubs, their hands permanently wrinkled and raw, earning a meagre living from the dirt of others, a labour that aged them mercilessly and was paid almost nothing. So spare a thought as you toss a shirt casually into a machine and forget about it, for the Victorian laundress and her week-long war against dirt. It was hot, exhausting, knuckle-shredding work that swallowed days whole and left her aching and damp from dawn till dark. In a world without machines, clean clothes were not a convenience but a hard-fought victory, one steaming, scrubbing, miserable garment at a time. Now that you're clean, or at least cleaner than you were, let's go somewhere, which in Victorian England is easier said than done. The city sprawls vast and ever-growing. The distances are real, and your options for crossing them range from the exhausting to the alarming. There are no cars, no trains beneath the streets at first, and certainly nothing you can summon to your door with a tap of a finger. You walk, you squeeze aboard something pulled by a tired horse, or, if you're lucky and the era has progressed far enough, you brave the marvel and the menace of the railway. Choose carefully, because none of these is quite as pleasant as it sounds. For most people, most of the time, the answer is simple. You walk. The poor walk everywhere, often for miles to work and back, through the filth and the crowds and the choking fog, in worn boots or no boots at all. Walking is free, and free is what the working poor can afford, so the pavements teem with people on foot, threading their way through the churning muck of the streets, dodging carts and crossing sweepers, arriving at their destinations footsore, splashed and faintly grimy from the journey. If you can spare the fare, there is the omnibus, a large horse-drawn carriage that trundles along set routes, packing in as many passengers as can possibly be wedged aboard. It is cramped, slow, and jolting. The interior thick with a smell of damp wool and unwashed neighbours, and the seats on the open top deck expose you to the weather and the soot in equal measure. Still, it carries you across the city for a modest sum, and for the clerk and the shopkeeper it is a genuine convenience, however undignified the squeeze. For those with deeper pockets and a need for speed, the hansom cab is the answer. A nimble two-wheeled carriage with the driver perched up behind, pulled by a single horse through the crowded streets at a pace that feels positively reckless. It is the era's version of hailing a ride on demand, quick and relatively private, though the fares put it well beyond the reach of the ordinary worker. The cabs dart and weave through the traffic, and a journey in one is brisk, exciting, and occasionally terrifying. Then comes the great wonder of the age, the railway. The coming of the trains transforms the country, shrinking vast distances to mere hours and allowing ordinary people to travel as never before, to work, to visit family, even to escape to the seaside for a day. The stations rise as cathedrals of iron and glass. The locomotives thunder and steam, and the whole nation is stitched together by gleaming rails. It is genuinely miraculous. A technology that remade the very experience of distance and time. But the railway, like everything else in this era, divides sharply by class. The wealthy ride in comfortable cushioned compartments, while the poor are packed into bare, open, or barely sheltered carriages, exposed to the cinders, the smoke, and the cold, jolted along in conditions that reflect their station as surely as everything else in their lives does. The same train carries luxury and misery in different carriages, the social order preserved even at speed. And underlying it all sat horsepower, quite literally, for the city ran on the labour of countless horses, hauling the omnibuses, the cabs, the carts, and the carriages. They filled the streets, fouled the roads, and dropped dead in their traces under the strain, a living engine of transport whose byproducts coated every surface and assaulted every nose. So getting around the great smoky city was a matter of money, patience, and a strong stomach, whether you trudged on foot through the muck, squeezed aboard a jolting omnibus, splurged on a darting hansom cab, or thundered along the miraculous new rails. The Victorians conquered distance as never before, and they did it, as they did most things, with one eye always firmly fixed on who could afford the better seat. After so much grimness, let's end with something warmer, because the Victorians, for all their hardships, gave us the very idea of Christmas as we know it. Much of what you picture when you imagine the holiday, the tree, the cards, the carols, the great groaning feast, was either invented or transformed during this era, shaped into the cosy, sentimental celebration we still cling to today. So pull your chair toward the fire, because for once we're talking about a day the Victorians actually looked forward to, and one they decorated with all the enthusiasm of a people who knew exactly how cold and hard the rest of the year could be. The centrepiece, quite literally, was the Christmas tree, a custom popularised when the Queen's German husband brought the tradition to the royal household, and a famous illustration showed the royal family gathered round a decorated fir. What the royals did, the nation rushed to copy, and soon trees appeared in parlours across the land, hung with candles, sweets, small gifts and homemade ornaments. The sight of a tree glowing with real candle flames was magical, breathtaking, and given the era's relationship with open flame and dry pine needles, a genuine fire hazard of the first order. Then there was the Christmas card, an invention of the age that turned the season into a flurry of posted greetings. The expanding postal service made it possible to send cheap, cheerful cards to friends and relations, and the custom caught on with remarkable speed, filling mantelpieces with festive scenes of robins, holly and snow. It was a small, charming way to reach across distances, and it created an entire industry overnight, as well as the now familiar seasonal panic of remembering exactly whom one had forgotten. The feast, of course, was the beating heart of the day, and the Victorians approached it with tremendous appetite. The roast goose gave way over time to the turkey on the grander tables, surrounded by all the trimmings and crowned by the flaming Christmas pudding, that dense, dark, brandy-soaked dome carried in a light to gasps of delight. For families who scrimped and saved all year, the Christmas dinner was a rare moment of genuine abundance, a single day on which even modest households strained to put something special and plentiful upon the table. Much of the era's sentimental, generous vision of Christmas was shaped by its literature, and by one famous tale in particular, a ghostly story of a miserly old man redeemed by the spirit of the season. That story, and others like it, helped fix the idea of Christmas as a time of charity, family, warmth, and goodwill toward the poor, a moment when even the hardest heart might be softened and the comfortable might spare a thought for those in need. The holiday became, in part, a yearly reminder of kindness in a world that offered little of it. The day was filled, too, with the customs we still recognise, the singing of carols door to door, the hanging of holly, ivy and mistletoe, the pulling of crackers with their snaps and paper crowns and small surprises, and the giving of gifts among family. For children especially, Christmas became a day of wonder and treats, a bright spot in lives that were often anything but, a single occasion devoted to delight. So as your own day draws to its close, picture a Victorian family gathered round their candlelit tree, cards upon the mantel, the pudding aflame, voices raised in a carol against the cold dark outside. For all the soot and struggle of their ordinary days, they built themselves one shining occasion of warmth and plenty, and in doing so they handed down to us the very shape of the holiday we still treasure. It may be the kindest thing the year ever made, and it has, rather wonderfully, refused to go out of fashion. And so our long Victorian day comes quietly to its end. You woke shivering in the cold and the dark, braved the chamber pot, choked down a breakfast of dubious origin, and laced yourself into a contraption that rearranged your ribs. You breathed air you could practically chew, drank water that schemed against you, and laboured through hours that would flatten most of us, all while keeping a perfectly respectable expression fixed upon your face. You dodged the fog, the filth, the doctor, and the ever-looming shadow of the workhouse, and somehow you made it through to nightfall in one weary, sooty piece. It was a hard age. There is no pretending otherwise. It asked everything of ordinary people and gave back precious little, and it built its railways and its wonders upon backs that ached and lungs that filled with smoke. Yet those same people found their music halls and their parlour songs, lit their Christmas trees against the dark, mourned their dead with tenderness, and rose each cold morning to do it all again. There is a stubborn, quiet courage in that, the kind history rarely pauses to thank. So tonight, as you settle into a warm and clean bed, with hot water at the turn of a tap and light at the touch of a switch, perhaps whisper a small thank you to the Victorians who came before. They endured the soot and the corsets and the dangerous water so that the comforts you barely notice might one day come to be. Because history is grimy and exhausting and frequently unfair, but it is also proof of how stubborn, hopeful, and quietly heroic ordinary people can be. And on that gentle thought, let your eyes grow heavy, let the gas lamps dim, and let the long Victorian day fade softly to black. Sleep well.